Her father sold her for $400 and a cleared debt. Not her labor. Not her time. Her. Signed on a piece of paper like she was a horse or a plot of dry land, with a name and a price and a man waiting to collect. Adeline Carter was 22 years old when she learned that the one person in the world who was supposed to protect her had been calculating her worth for years. And the number he finally settled on wasn't even enough to buy a decent saddle. If you've ever had someone you love treat you like you were nothing, stay with me. This story is for you. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this has traveled. And if it moves you, hit that like button. Let's begin. The rain started the way trouble usually did in Black Hollow. Quietly, without warning. The kind that didn't announce itself with thunder or lightning, but simply arrived and refused to leave. Adeline Carter stood at the kitchen window, watching it streak down the glass in crooked lines. The lantern behind her threw her shadow long across the floor, and she had that particular feeling she'd learned to recognize over the years. The one that settled in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. Something was wrong. The house was too quiet. Her father had been home for 3 hours and hadn't said a word, which meant he'd either won big at the tables or lost everything. Given the way he'd come through the door, not drunk, not loud, but careful, moving like a man carrying something fragile, she already knew. He'd lost. She turned from the window and looked at him. Frank Carter sat at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands, turning it by the brim the way he always did when he was about to say something he'd rehearsed. He was 51 years old and looked 70. The gambling had done that, carved the years into his face ahead of schedule, left his eyes with that particular hollowness of a man who'd spent too long chasing the next hand. "Adeline," he said. "How much?" she asked. He looked up. Something moved across his face. Not shame, exactly. More like discomfort. The expression of a man who'd already talked himself out of feeling what he should be feeling. "It ain't like that." "How much, Papa?" He set the hat on the table. His hands were shaking slightly, though she'd long since stopped reading that as remorse. His hands always shook these days. 400, give or take. $400. She let that land. It was more money than they'd seen in 2 years. It was also, she knew without needing to ask, not money he'd borrowed. Frank Carter didn't borrow. He wagered. "And you don't have it," she said. "No." "Who do you owe?" He was quiet for a moment. The rain tapped at the window. Somewhere out in the dark, a horse shifted in the small pen beside the house, hooves thudding soft in the mud. "Silas Boone," he said. The stone in her chest got heavier. Silas Boone was not the kind of man you owed money to. He wasn't even the kind of man you were careful with. He was the kind of man you stayed away from, entirely, the way you stayed away from a spring that might be poisoned. Not because you'd tested it, but because 3 people who'd drunk from it were dead. He ran a crew of riders out of the canyon country north of town. Cattle that disappeared, travelers who turned up missing, homesteaders who suddenly decided to sell and move east. Black Hollow had a name for that kind of activity. They called it Boone's Luck, and they said it with their eyes down. "Papa?" Her voice came out flat, controlled. "What did you put up against $400? He didn't answer right away. "Papa, I didn't have anything else." He said it quickly, like speed would soften it. "The land's already mortgaged. The horses ain't worth $40 between them. I didn't have—" "What did you put up?" He finally looked at her, and she saw it in his face before he said the word. Saw it in the way he couldn't quite hold her eyes. Saw it in the way his jaw moved twice before sound came out. "You," he said. Adeline didn't scream. She didn't throw anything. She didn't cry. She stood very still in the kitchen of the house she'd grown up in the town she'd spent her whole life trying to find a way out of. And she looked at her father, really looked at him, maybe for the first time in years. Looked at him without the layer of hope she'd always maintained, the fragile belief that underneath the gambling and the drinking and the failure, there was still the man who'd carried her on his shoulders when she was 4 years old and showed her the stars and told her their names. That man wasn't here. Maybe he hadn't been for a long time. "You wagered me," she said. Not a question. "Adeline, you sat across a table from Silas Boone and you put my name down like I was property." Her voice was still flat, still controlled. She couldn't feel her hands. "And you lost." I thought I had a good hand. I don't care about the hand. She took a breath. What does he want? Frank Carter looked at the table. You know what he wants. She did. Black Hollow was small enough that everyone knew what Silas Boone did with women who ended up in his debt or his possession. Some of them had come through town, briefly, and the bruises told the story well enough. Most didn't come through town at all. When does he come to collect? She asked. Tomorrow morning. She nodded once. Then she walked to her room, sat on the edge of her bed in the dark, and thought about what her life had just become. She didn't sleep. There wasn't much point. By 3 a.m, she'd gone through every option she had, laid them out methodically, the way she'd taught herself to think when things went bad. Strip away the panic, look at what's real, see what's actually there. She had $11 saved in a tin under the floorboard. She had a horse that was 12 years old and slow. She had no family outside of Black Hollow, no friends with resources, no one who owed her a favor worth more than a meal. She could run. That was the obvious answer. But run to where? On what? And with the knowledge that Silas Boone had riders who knew this territory better than she ever would. A woman alone on the plains with $11 didn't last long. It didn't even need to be Boone's men who found her. It could be anyone. She could go to the sheriff. She actually laughed at that one, quiet in the dark. Sheriff Tate had been taking money from Boone's operation for 3 years. Everyone knew it. No one said it out loud. She could stay and fight. She kept coming back to this one, kept holding it up and examining it, looking for something real in it. But fighting Boone with what? She had a shotgun with 4 shells and the ability to throw a straight punch. He'd have 6 men and a legal piece of paper with her father's signature on it. The rain kept falling. Around 4 a.m, she heard horses in the yard. She was at the window before she was fully awake, the shotgun in her hands without consciously deciding to pick it up. 2 horses. One rider holding a lantern, the light swinging in the rain. The other, she went still. The second rider sat his horse the way men sit when they're not thinking about it, not performing anything, just occupying space without apology. He was tall, even seated, broad through the shoulders, wearing a dark coat that was soaked through. He wasn't looking at the house. He was looking at the yard, at the pen, at the perimeter of the property, taking inventory of it the way a man does when he's thinking about something other than the obvious. Her father's voice came from downstairs, rough with sleep and something else. Fear, maybe. Who's there? Rowan Hayes? The voice carried through the rain without effort. Not loud, just clear. I'm looking for Frank Carter. Adeline had heard that name. Most people in this part of the territory had. Rowan Hayes owned the Running H Ranch, 30 miles west, 12,000 acres of grass and timber country that he'd built from nothing over 15 years. He was known for 3 things. He ran good cattle, he paid his debts, and he wasn't someone you crossed twice. There were stories about him, the kind that grew in the telling. She'd never put much stock in stories. She heard her father open the door below, heard the murmur of voices, the scrape of boots on the threshold. Then her father's voice, higher than normal. You can't just... I already did. Hayes, still calm. Get dressed. We need to talk. Adeline came downstairs with the shotgun. Rowan Hayes was standing in her kitchen looking at nothing in particular when she came through the doorway. He turned when he heard her, and she raised the gun to waist level. Not aiming it at him, not exactly, but making the position of it clear. He looked at the gun, then at her. He had a lean, weathered face, maybe 35, maybe 40, hard to tell with men who worked outside. Dark eyes that didn't show much, a jaw that needed shaving. He was wet from the rain, and he dripped on her floor, and he didn't seem particularly concerned about any of it. You're Adeline Carter, he said. That's right. Your father owe you an explanation, he said. It wasn't quite a question. He owes me more than that. She looked at her father, who was standing near the stove looking at the floor. What is this? Hayes spoke before Frank could. I bought your father's debt from Silas Boone 3 hours ago. He said it the way you'd say the weather, plain, without decoration. $400 and a bottle of rye whiskey. Boone was willing to negotiate. She stared at him. You bought it? Yes. Why? He was quiet for a moment, not uncomfortable, just choosing. Because Boone's a violent man and you'd end up hurt or dead within a year. And because your father couldn't solve this problem himself. He glanced at Frank with something that wasn't contempt but was close to its cooler cousin. As is evident. So now I owe you $400. Your father owes it, not you. That's a fine distinction when his name is on a piece of paper that says, I'm collateral. Something shifted in his expression. Something almost like recognition, or maybe respect. You're right, he said. It is a fine distinction, which is why I'm here at 4 in the morning instead of waiting until business hours. He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper, set it on the table. That's the debt note. Your father's name and the terms. I'm canceling it. She didn't move toward it. In exchange for what? Nothing. He held her eyes. The debt is gone. Your father owes me nothing. You owe me nothing. Men don't ride 30 miles in a rainstorm at 4 in the morning to cancel debts for nothing. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. No, he said, they don't. He pulled out a chair, turned it, sat on it backwards in that particular way of men who'd spent more time in saddles than at tables. I have a proposition. Not a trade, not a debt, a proposition. She kept the shotgun where it was. I'm listening. I need a capable person at the ranch. Someone who can manage the household, keep the books, work alongside the crew when we're short-handed. It's hard work, long hours. The country west of here isn't gentle. He paused. I'll pay you a wage. Real money, not credit. You'll have your own room, your own space. You work for me and I answer to you the same as you answer to me. If something's wrong, you say so. If you want to leave, you leave. No contract that keeps you. No obligation beyond what work requires. The kitchen was very quiet. The rain had softened outside, just a hiss now against the glass. And if I say no, she asked, then I ride back to my ranch and you handle what's coming however you choose to handle it. He said it without apology. Boone doesn't know I bought the debt yet. He'll figure it out by morning. When he does, he'll be angry, and he'll come looking for something to take in exchange for losing what he thought was his. That something will probably be you, since you're the easiest target in this house. You're saying I don't have a choice. I'm saying your options are limited. There's a difference. He looked at her steadily. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you what I see. What you do with what I see is your business. She looked at her father. Frank Carter was staring at the floor with the expression of a man who understood. Somewhere in whatever was left of him, what he'd done to his daughter, and couldn't look at it directly. He didn't say anything. He didn't argue for her to go or beg her to stay. He just stood there with his hands at his sides, and Adeline felt something finalize inside her. A door closing quietly on a room she'd spent 22 years trying to make livable. She looked back at Hayes. I want the debt note, she said. It's yours. And I want it in writing that I work for wages, real wages, with the amount specified. He nodded. $30 a month, room and board included. We can put it in writing before we leave. We leave tonight? We leave now. He glanced toward the window. Rain's not stopping, and Boone's riders are early risers. She stood there for another moment, the shotgun still in her hands, and she thought, clear-eyed, without illusion, about what she was doing. She was getting on a horse with a man she didn't know, riding 30 miles through the dark and rain to a ranch she'd never seen, to work for a stranger whose reasons she didn't fully understand. She was doing it because her other options were worse, and she knew it, and she refused to pretend otherwise. That wasn't rescue. She understood that. It was a trade of one uncertainty for another. But Hayes had given her something Silas Boone never would have. A choice. A real one, however narrow. Give me 10 minutes, she said. I need to pack. She packed fast, the way she'd always packed in her mind during the years she'd imagined leaving. Essentials only, nothing sentimental, nothing that would slow her down. 2 changes of clothes, her mother's hunting knife in its sheath, the $11 from under the floorboard, a photograph she didn't look at, just folded and put in her coat pocket, the shotgun and the 4 shells, because she wasn't leaving that behind. She came back downstairs to find Hayes standing outside on the porch, giving her father whatever privacy the situation allowed. Frank Carter was still at the table. He looked up when she came through. Adeline, he started. Don't. Her voice came out quiet. Not angry. She didn't have anger in her right now, just something worn and tired. Just don't. I made a mistake. You made a choice. There's a difference. She picked up the debt note from the table, folded it, put it with the photograph. You made a lot of choices over a lot of years, and they all pointed in the same direction, and now we're here. She looked at him. I hope you find a way to live with it, Papa. I genuinely mean that, but I'm not staying to watch you try. She walked out the door without looking back. The horse Hayes had brought for her was a gray mare, young and solid, with good feet and a steady eye. She approved of the horse before she approved of anything else about the situation, which seemed like reasonable judgment. She tied her bag behind the saddle, checked the girth, and mounted without help while Hayes watched without offering any. They rode out of Black Hollow in the rain. For the first hour, neither of them said much. The road west was muddy and slow, and the horses picked their way through the dark with the careful patience of animals that had done this before. The lantern from Hayes's rider, a compact, taciturn man named Duff, who seemed to have been born without the capacity for unnecessary speech, lit the road ahead in a yellow circle that the rain kept trying to extinguish. Adeline watched the town disappear behind them, the lights going dim, the shapes of buildings softening in the dark, until there was just the road and the rain and the flat black plain spreading out on every side. She didn't feel relief. She'd expected to feel something like it, but what she actually felt was more complicated. A dull, tired alertness, the way your body feels when it's stopped running and hasn't yet decided what to do next. She was grateful, she supposed, in the cold-blooded way you're grateful to have escaped something terrible. But gratitude wasn't the same as trust, and riding beside a stranger through the dark wasn't the same as being safe. You don't have to be quiet on my account, Hayes said, after a while. She looked over at him. He was riding easy, relaxed, the kind of relaxed you earn through years in the saddle. I wasn't being quiet on your account, she said. Fair enough. Another stretch of silence. The rain was lighter now, more mist than rain, and the darkness was beginning to separate into shapes. Hills to the north, a line of cottonwoods along a dry creek to the south, the sky overhead going from solid black to a slightly lighter shade of gray. Why did you really come? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. I told you. You told me the practical reason. You bought a debt to keep Boone from collecting it. You offered me a job. That's the practical reason. She kept her eyes on the road ahead. I'm asking why. He didn't answer right away. She'd noticed that about him. He didn't fill silence with words the way anxious people did. He sat inside it comfortably, which was either the sign of a patient man or a guarded one. Probably both. I knew your mother, he said finally. She turned to look at him. Years ago, before she died. She came through the territory with your father back when he was still, before the gambling took hold. She was a capable woman, sharp, funny in a dry kind of way. He paused. She told me she had a daughter who was going to do better than this place. The photograph in her coat pocket felt suddenly heavier. She died when I was 9. I know. You remembered her? Yes. And you remembered she had a daughter? Yes. Adeline processed this, tried to find the angle in it, the self-interest, the exchange she was missing. She couldn't find one, which made her trust it less rather than more. She'd learned that gifts without visible strings were usually the most dangerous kind. That's a strange reason to ride 30 miles in the rain, she said. Most good reasons are strange when you say them out loud. She turned that over in her mind. The mare beneath her moved steadily, and the gray horizon ahead was beginning to show the first faint suggestion of light along its bottom edge. If I find out this is something else, she said, if I find out you have intentions or expectations that you haven't told me, you'll leave, he said. Not dismissively, just stating a fact. I'll leave and I'll make sure you regret it. He looked at her then, a quick, direct look. I believe you, he said. She held his gaze for a moment, then she turned back to the road. They rode on into this gray beginning of morning, and the rain finally stopped, and the plains opened up around them the way plains do when the light changes. Suddenly enormous, suddenly real, the grass going silver with standing water, and the sky turning from black to charcoal to the color of old pewter. It was not beautiful exactly. It was too large and too indifferent to be beautiful in any comfortable way. But it was honest. It didn't pretend to be anything it wasn't. Adeline found she could respect that. They crossed the high ridge into the running H's Valley just as the sun pushed above the eastern hills. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Something grim, maybe. Something that matched the gravity of the situation. A place that looked like what it was. A ranch in hard country run by a man with a hard reputation. The valley was wide and grass-covered, rimmed by timber on the northern face. A creek ran through it, fed by whatever snowmelt still lingered in the high country, and the grass along its banks was a brighter green than anything she'd seen in the parched flats around Black Hollow. The main house was long and low, built from local timber, with a covered porch running its full length. Smoke was already rising from the cookhouse chimney, corrals, a large barn, a bunkhouse, outbuildings she'd need time to inventory. It was a working ranch, clearly, and a successful one. The fences were in good repair. The cattle visible in the east pasture were fat and well-tended. "It's real," she said, before she thought about saying it. "What is?" Hayes asked. "I thought it might be—" She stopped. She'd been about to say smaller, but that wasn't quite right either. She'd been about to say less. "Most places are smaller than their reputation," he said. "This one isn't." He said it without pride. Just fact. They rode down into the valley as the light came on full, and the cook, a wide, gray-haired woman named Bertie, who Adeline would learn had worked the ranch for 9 years and held opinions she was never shy about sharing, came out onto the cookhouse porch and looked them over with the calculating eye of someone assessing livestock at auction. "This the Carter girl?" Bertie asked Hayes. "This is Adeline Carter," Hayes said with slight emphasis. Bertie looked at Adeline. "You ride?" "Yes." "You cook?" "When I have to." Bertie seemed to find this acceptable. "You're in the room at the end of the house. Wood stacked outside. Breakfast in 20 minutes. She turned and went back inside without further ceremony. Adeline looked at Hayes. "She's like that with everyone, Chet," he said. "I don't mind it," Adeline said, and found she meant it. There was something refreshing about a woman who told you exactly where you stood without apology. She'd had enough of apology. She dismounted in the yard as one of the hands came to take the horses. She stood for a moment with her bag in her hand and the debt note in her pocket and the knife at her hip. And she looked at the ranch spread out around her in the morning light. The smoke, the cattle, the sound of voices from the bunkhouse, the ordinary machinery of a working place. And she felt something unexpected. Not safety, not trust. Those would come later if they came at all, and she wasn't naive enough to assume they would. What she felt was something simpler and more basic. Possibility. The sense that what happened next wasn't already decided. That the next page wasn't already written. She'd never felt that before. Not once, in 22 years. She picked up her bag and walked toward the house. Her room was small and practical and had a window that faced east, which meant she'd wake to light instead of dark. The bed had a wool blanket that smelled like cedar. There was a writing desk with an oil lamp and a small shelf where she arranged the few things she'd brought, including the photograph, which she set face down. Not because she didn't want to see her mother's face, because she wasn't ready yet. She sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the ranch come to life around her. The clatter from the cookhouse, boots on the porch, the distant sound of cattle and horses, someone laughing at something. The ordinary sounds of people going about the business of a day. She'd expected punishment, expected rules and demands, and the immediate establishment of who was in charge and who was not. Expected to understand within the first hour the exact nature of what she'd traded herself into. Instead, she'd gotten a room with an east window and 20 minutes until breakfast. She didn't know what to do with that. She did what her mother would have told her to do. She washed her face, changed her shirt, and went to find out what work needed doing. Breakfast was the first test. Not an obvious one, just the quiet, persistent test that any new situation ran on you. The assessment of where you fit and how you'd behave. There were 7 ranch hands. They ranged from Duff, the taciturn rider from the night before, who acknowledged her with a nod, and went back to his coffee, to a young man named Cody, who was maybe 18 and clearly hadn't been told the correct way to conceal the fact that he found her interesting, to a grizzled pair of older hands named Abe and Joaquin, who'd worked together so long they'd begun to finish each other's sentences. They were polite, little formal. The particular caution of men who'd been told, presumably, that there was a new situation at the ranch and to mind themselves. She recognized the performance of good behavior and found it more honest than she expected. They were trying, genuinely, even if they weren't sure yet what to try at. Hayes sat at the head of the table and ate without making conversation the anchor of the meal, which she noted. Some men used mealtimes to establish their position, kept everyone else listening to them to remind everyone of the structure. Hayes ate, answered questions when they were directed at him, and let the meal be a meal. Bertie put food on the table and collected plates and said exactly as much as she felt like saying, which turned out to be a fair amount. She told Adeline where the supplies were kept, where the ledgers were, that the books needed attention because Hayes couldn't add a column of numbers without getting a different answer each time, and that if Adeline broke any of Bertie's cast iron, she would make her regret it in ways that didn't require violence. "I'll take care of your cast iron," Adeline said. Bertie looked at her steadily for a moment. Then she put another biscuit on Adeline's plate and went back to the stove. After breakfast, Hayes found her on the porch. "Bertie will show you the ledgers this morning," he said. "This afternoon, if you're willing, Abe can take you out on the east fence line. Get you oriented. You don't have to—" "I'll go," she said. He nodded. No fuss about it. No elaborate explanation of why it was a good idea. He was a man, she was beginning to understand, who said what he meant and then waited to see what you did with it. She watched him walk toward the barn. She thought about what he'd said on the road, about her mother, about remembering a conversation years ago with a woman who'd told him her daughter was going to do better. She still didn't understand it. She still didn't trust it. She filed it in the part of her mind where she kept things that were real but not yet explained, and she turned back to the business of the day. The ledgers were a disaster. Someone had been keeping them on and off for 3 years with no consistent method and a fundamental misunderstanding of how debits worked. Adeline sat down at the writing desk in the small office off the main room, with a cup of Bertie's coffee that was strong enough to strip paint, and started going through them page by page. She'd kept her father's accounts for years, tracked what little money came in and what catastrophic amounts went out, tried to build a picture of their finances that she could use to argue him back from the edge of one disaster or another. She'd never succeeded, but she'd gotten good at the math, good at seeing patterns in numbers that people assumed were just chaos. The ranch's finances were not chaos. They were simply neglected. The underlying numbers were healthy, better than healthy. The running H turned a genuine profit in cattle and some timber, with room to expand if someone paid attention to the opportunity. It had just been running on instinct and competence for years, without anyone writing it down properly. She got to work. By noon, she had 2 years of accounts reconstructed in a clean ledger. By 2 in the afternoon, she had a clear picture of where the ranch stood in 3 specific areas where money was being lost to inefficiency. She found Hayes in the barn. "You lost about $60 last year on the North Timber lease," she said without preamble. "You're paying for access to timber you're only using a third of. Either cut your lease or start using the whole thing." He turned from the horse he was working on and looked at her. "I know about the timber." "Then why haven't you fixed it?" "Haven't had time." "You have time now." She held out the ledger. "I also found a feed supplier in the accounts who's been overcharging you for 2 years. Small amounts. The kind that don't jump out if you're not looking. It adds up to about $40. He took the ledger, looked at it, looked at her. "You did all this morning," he said. "The afternoon, too." She paused. "Your accounts were a mess." "I know." Something in his expression shifted slightly. "Thank you." "You're paying me," she said. "It's not a favor." "It's still worth saying." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned toward the door. "I'm going out with Abe to look at the fence line. I'll have the full account summary on your desk by tonight." She was halfway through the barn door when he spoke behind her. "Adeline." She stopped. "You're not a prisoner here," he said. "I know it doesn't feel that way yet. I know you're watching everything and trusting nothing and waiting for the thing that's going to tell you what this actually is." He paused. "That's smart. That's the right thing to do. I'm just telling you, take whatever time you need. There's no deadline on it." She stood in the barn doorway with the afternoon light coming in behind her, and she thought about Frank Carter at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands, and about Silas Boone, whose name made people look at the ground, and about 30 miles of rain and a gray mare, and a man who'd ridden through the dark to cancel a debt that wasn't his to cancel. She didn't say anything. She walked out into the afternoon sun and went to find Abe and the east fence line and the work that was waiting. But she thought about it for a long time. That night, after the ranch had gone quiet and the hands were in the bunkhouse, and Bertie had banked the cookhouse fire. Adeline sat at the writing desk in her room with the lamp turned low and the photograph face up for the first time. Her mother looked back at her. Young. Younger than Adeline was now when this picture was taken. Sharp-eyed and unsentimental, with a set to her jaw that Adeline recognized from her own mirror. Not a soft face, not a gentle one, a face that had looked at hard things and not looked away. She told me she had a daughter who was going to do better than this place. Adeline sat with that for a while. Then she set the photograph on the shelf where she could see it, put out the lamp, and lay down on the cedar-smelling bed while the valley sounds came through the east window, the creek and the cattle and the wind in the grass. And she told herself, plainly and without sentiment, she was here. She was alive. She was not owned. What came next was unknown. Unknown was the best thing she'd been given in years. She slept. The first week was the hardest, not because anyone made it hard, but because Adeline kept waiting for them to. She'd spent 22 years learning to read the weather in people. The shift in tone that meant a demand was coming. The particular quiet before someone decided you owed them something. She'd gotten good at it the way you get good at anything you practice out of necessity. So she watched, she cataloged. Every interaction at the Running H went through that filter before she allowed herself to react to it. What she found confused her. Abe showed her the fence lines on the East Range without condescension, explained the landmarks she'd need to navigate by, and when her horse shied at a prairie dog hole and she nearly went over its neck, he didn't laugh. Just waited until she'd sorted herself out and said, "That hole's been there a year. I keep meaning to fill it," as if the near fall was the fence's fault and not hers. Cody, the youngest hand, was transparent enough to be harmless. He admired her from a distance with the uncomplicated openness of a boy who hadn't learned yet to disguise what he felt. And when she put him to work helping her move supply inventory, he did it without complaint and turned out to be genuinely useful. Joaquin and Abe between them had 60 years of ranch knowledge and shared it freely, not because they were asked, but because they were the kind of men who simply told you what they knew when they thought you needed it. And Bertie. Bertie was a category of her own. The cook had worked the Running H since before half the current hands were hired, and she ran the cookhouse the way certain women run things, with absolute competence and zero patience for people who confused competence with gentleness. She wasn't gentle. She was honest, which was better. On Adeline's third morning, she put a mug of coffee in front of her and said, without looking up from the biscuit dough she was working, "You're still sleeping light." Adeline looked up from the ledger she'd brought to breakfast. "How do you know that?" "You're at this table before sunrise every day. Either you can't sleep or you don't trust yourself to." There wasn't a polite answer to that, so Adeline didn't try for one. "Both," she said. Bertie nodded once like she'd expected that. "It'll settle," she said. "Not quickly, but it'll settle." She turned back to her biscuits. "You take sugar?" "No." "Good. We're low." That was the end of the conversation, and somehow it was enough. What didn't settle? What Adeline turned over in her mind during the long hours in the saddle and the quiet evenings with the ledgers was Rowan Hayes himself. He was harder to read than anyone else on the ranch, which she supposed was inevitable. He was in charge of the place, which meant he'd learned to keep some things inside where they wouldn't affect the people working for him. She understood that. What she didn't understand was the particular quality of his restraint. The way it never felt like suppression, never felt like a man holding something back that wanted to get out. It felt more like a man who'd thought about what he wanted to say and consistently decided the world didn't need all of it. He worked hard. That much was plain. He was never the first to bed or the last to rise, but he was consistently present in whatever needed doing. Riding fence, moving cattle, fixing what broke, making the 100 small decisions that kept a place this size running. He didn't direct from a distance. He worked beside the hands, and they followed him with the easy loyalty of people who respected rather than feared the person they worked for. He also, she noticed, never once told her what to do. He'd suggest. He'd ask. He'd mention something that needed doing, and then wait to see if she'd take it up. But in 2 weeks on the ranch, he had not issued her a single order, which was either the most sophisticated form of control she'd ever encountered or something genuinely different from anything she'd known. She was still deciding which. It was Duff, of all people, who shifted her understanding. Duff who barely spoke, who communicated primarily in nods and shoulder movements, and the occasional word deployed with surgical precision. She was riding with him on the West Range, checking the water troughs, when he said, without apparent context, he rode out to Black Hollow twice before. She looked over at him. Before what? Before your father's debt. He rode out there 2 years ago, then again last winter. Duff's eyes stayed on the middle distance. Checked on the place. Didn't talk to anyone, just rode past. She held that. The wind came across the grass and pushed the mare's mane sideways. How do you know this? I ride with him most places. She was quiet for a moment. He never said anything about why he was going. No, Duff glanced at her. He don't say much about things like that. She thought about what Hayes had told her on the road that first night, about her mother, about a conversation he'd remembered. She'd filed it in her mind as something real but unexplained, and now there was more to add to that file. 2 rides to Black Hollow. 2 years of quietly checking on a family that wasn't his to check on. The night Silas Boone held a debt note with her name on it, Hayes had appeared with $400 before morning. That wasn't coincidence. That wasn't a man who'd happened to hear about a problem and decided to involve himself. That was someone who'd been paying attention for a long time. She didn't confront him about it, not that day. She needed to think about it first, sit with what it meant, decide whether it frightened her or steadied her. She'd learned the hard way that reacting before understanding was how you made bad situations worse. So she watched him more carefully instead. She watched the way he talked to his horses. Not with the sentimental chatter some men used, but with a kind of practical address, naming what he was about to do before he did it, giving the animal information instead of emotion. She watched the way he handled the ranch hand's problems, which came to him in a steady stream. A dispute about workload, a question about a sick calf, Cody having gotten himself into some situation in town that needed untangling without causing more trouble than it solved. He dealt with all of it without theatrics, without making anyone feel stupid for bringing it to him, without using the moment to remind anyone who was in charge. She watched the way he occasionally sat on the porch in the evening, not doing anything, just sitting. No book, no drink worth mentioning, no company, just watching the valley go dark in a way that suggested he found something in the watching itself. She came out one evening and sat in the other chair without being invited. He didn't look surprised. He just moved his coffee mug to his other hand to make space at the armrest. They sat there for a while without talking. The valley was going through its nightly change, the light pulling back from the grass, the shadows thickening under the timber, the first stars coming up over the eastern ridge. It was the kind of quiet that didn't need to be filled. Duff told me, she said finally. Hayes looked over at her, waited. About Black Hollow, the 2 times you rode out. She kept her eyes on the valley. You were checking on me. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, without telling me, without saying anything. You didn't know me. If I'd made contact, it would have been... I didn't want to complicate things. You complicated them considerably when you showed up at 4 a.m. That was necessary. He paused. The other times weren't. She finally looked at him. Why didn't you do something sooner? If you knew the situation at that house... Because it wasn't my situation to fix. He said it plainly, without defensiveness. Your father was alive, your house was standing, you were managing. It wasn't comfortable, but it was yours to manage. I had no right to step in when you hadn't asked for it and didn't need it. He looked back at the valley. When Boone's name came into it, that changed what was coming. That wasn't something you could manage alone. You don't know what I can manage. No, he said. I don't. But Silas Boone isn't a problem that resolves itself. And you didn't have 40 armed men or $400 in cash, and those are the 2 things that make Boone listen. A beat. I had both. Adeline sat with that. It was a sound argument. Logical, practical, hard to argue against on its facts. What made her keep turning it over wasn't the logic, it was the thing underneath it. The question she hadn't quite formed yet. The question of what a man wanted in return for this kind of attention. My mother, she said, tell me what she was like the time you met her. Hayes set his mug down on the arm of the chair. It was in '79. She and your father came through the territory on their way south. They stopped at a ranch I was working on then. Not this one. I hadn't built this yet. Your father wanted to buy a horse. Your mother wanted to have a conversation with someone who wasn't her husband. The corner of his mouth moved slightly. She was direct. Funny the way people are funny when they're not trying to be. She asked me what I was doing in this part of the country, and when I told her, she said it sounded like I was building something to replace something else. I said she was probably right. She said that was fine, as long as I knew the difference. Adeline was quiet. That sounded right. That sounded exactly right. She talked about you, he said. Said she had a girl at home being looked after by a neighbor. Said the girl was already smarter than both her parents, and it was going to be a problem when she figured that out. He paused. She said she wanted her daughter to have something that was hers, land or work, or just something that couldn't be taken, something she'd built herself. The valley had gone fully dark now. The stars were thick overhead, the way they got out here where there was no town light to wash them out. She died 6 months after that trip, Adeline said. I know. Did you know she was sick? I suspected. She didn't say, but there was something in the way she talked about you. The particular urgency of someone trying to get things said before they run out of time. Adeline pressed her lips together. She was not going to cry on this porch in front of this man she still wasn't sure about. She was simply not. She breathed through it and let it pass. You remembered all of this for 13 years, she said. I've got a good memory for things that matter. She didn't have an answer to that. She stood up, picked up her cup, and went inside. Not because she was upset, or not only because she was upset, but because she'd had enough truth for one evening and she needed to go somewhere quiet with it. She was almost to her room when she stopped, stood in the hallway with her hand on the doorframe. The ranch was settling into its night sounds around her. The creak of the house, the distant sounds from the bunkhouse, the creak audible through the window at the end of the hall. She went back to the porch. Hayes was still there. He looked up. Thank you, she said, for what you told me. About her. He nodded once. She went back inside. This time she didn't stop. She lay awake for a long time. Not the anxious wakefulness of the first week when she'd been cataloging threats. Something different. Something more like the feeling of a knot loosening. Not all the way, just enough to notice it had been there. She still didn't fully trust him. She still watched for the angle, the self-interest, the thing she was missing. But she was beginning to consider the possibility that she might not find it, that the alternative, strange and unfamiliar as it was, might actually be the truth, that he had remembered, and that remembering had been enough. The work continued, and so did she. By the end of her third week, Adeline had rebuilt the ranch accounts from scratch, identified and corrected the feed supplier overcharges, which, when she traced them back, totaled just over $50, and set up a simple ledger system that even Hayes could maintain without getting a different answer each time he added a column. She was also riding the fence lines 3 days a week, had learned enough about cattle to hold a useful conversation about the herd's condition, and could read the western sky well enough to predict rain about 2 hours out, which Abe said was better than most people managed in their first year. She was useful. That mattered to her in a way that was hard to explain, not because usefulness was the point, but because being genuinely useful in a place meant you belonged in it at least a little. You were part of the machinery. You had a function that was yours. One afternoon in her fourth week, she came back from the East Range to find a horse tied at the fence post out front that she didn't recognize. Not a working horse, too well groomed, shod with expensive shoes, the saddle with silver trim on the horn. A horse that said money without saying anything else. Bertie was on the porch, arms crossed. That was never a neutral posture on Bertie. "Who's here?" Adeline asked. "Man from your town," Bertie said. The word "your" had a particular weight on it. "Name a Calloway. Says he's a friend of your father's." Adeline's jaw tightened. She handed her reins to Cody without looking at him and went inside. The man sitting in the front room was about 50, well-dressed in the careful way of someone who wanted to appear more successful than they were. She didn't recognize the name Calloway, but she recognized the type. Black Hollow had a dozen of them, men who moved at the edges of the gambling world, who made their money facilitating other people's bad decisions. He stood when she came in, hat in hand, with the particular unctuous politeness of someone who thought manners would cover what they were actually there for. "Miss Carter, I've been hoping to speak with you." "I can see that," she said. She didn't sit. "What do you want?" Your father sent me. He's not well, Miss Carter. He's asking for you. He thought if my father is unwell, he can send for a doctor." She looked at the man steadily. "What else?" Calloway adjusted his hat in his hands. "Silas Boone he's been making things difficult in town since Mr. Hayes purchased the debt. He knows you're out here, and he's what? He's saying the transfer wasn't legal, that Hayes didn't have the right to—" "The transfer was legal." Hayes's voice came from the hallway. Adeline turned slightly. He was standing in the doorway, having come in from the back of the house, and his tone was pleasant and completely final. "I have the documentation. Your employer is welcome to challenge it in a court of law." Calloway looked between them. Whatever he'd expected to find here, a frightened girl he could talk into coming back, a situation he could exploit, he was recalibrating. "Mr. Boone isn't a patient man." "I know what Boone is," Hayes said. "Tell him I know, and that I'm keeping records of every conversation men like you have at my ranch." He moved to the door and opened it. "Ride safe, Mr. Calloway." Calloway left. Adeline watched his horse disappear down the valley road, and the stone feeling was back in her chest. Heavier this time, because she'd had 4 weeks of something close to peace, and now she remembered what waited at the edges of it. "He's gonna come," she said. Hayes was still at the door. "Yes." "Boone." "Probably not himself, his riders first." He turned from the door. "We've been expecting it." She looked at him sharply. "You've been expecting it." "I didn't want to alarm you before there was something specific to—" "Don't," she said. Her voice came out harder than she intended. "Don't decide what I need to know and when. That's not—" She stopped, breathed. "I left a place where someone else was making decisions about my life without telling me. I need you to not do that here. Whatever's coming, I need to know about it." He held her gaze. Something moved in his expression, not quite guilt, but close to it, the recognition of someone who'd meant well and missed the point. "You're right," he said. "I should have told you sooner. I'm sorry." She hadn't expected the apology. It landed differently than she thought it would. "Tell me now," she said. "All of it. What you're expecting and when and what the plan is." He did. He laid it out plainly. The threat Boone represented, the steps Hayes had already taken, the conversations with neighboring ranchers, the extra watch he'd set on the perimeter at night, the message he'd sent to the territorial marshal 3 weeks ago that had so far gone unanswered. He told her all of it, without softening or simplifying, and she listened with her arms crossed and her mind working and asked questions where she had them. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "I want a rifle," she said. "A good one, not the shotgun." He looked at her. "I can shoot," she said. "Better than most. My mother taught me." She paused. "I'm not hiding in the house while men defend something I've helped build." He didn't argue. He didn't explain why it might be dangerous or suggest she think about it. He just said, "I'll have Abe fit you for one tomorrow." She nodded. "And Hayes?" He waited. "When the next person comes from Black Hollow, or any message from my father, I want to know immediately. Not after you've decided what I can handle." "Agreed," he said. She held his gaze for another moment. Then she walked past him toward the kitchen, because she needed coffee and she needed to think, and the conversation had given her more than enough to think about. The valley outside the window was bright in the afternoon sun, the grass moving in waves where the wind crossed it, the cattle visible as dark shapes against the green of the far pasture. It looked peaceful. It looked like nothing was wrong and nothing was coming. She'd grown up in a place that looked like nothing was wrong, right up until it was. She'd stopped trusting appearances some years back, but she stood at that kitchen window with her coffee and she looked at the valley she'd ridden and worked and learned over 4 weeks, and she felt, underneath the dread, running quiet alongside it, that particular thing she'd felt on her first morning here. Possibility. The sense that what happened next wasn't already decided. She'd fought for nothing in Black Hollow. Every year, every decision, every attempt to hold things together had ultimately meant nothing, because the ground beneath her kept shifting, kept getting sold off or wagered away. This ground was different. She hadn't built it, and she didn't own it, but she'd worked it with her hands and her mind for a month now, and something about that work had put down the beginnings of a root that she could actually feel. She wasn't going to let Silas Boone pull it up. She finished her coffee, rinsed the cup, and went to find Abe. She wanted to know the best defensive positions on the east approach. She had questions she should have asked a week ago, and she was done waiting to ask them. The first attack came on a Tuesday, which somehow made it worse. There was something about a Tuesday, ordinary, midweek, unremarkable, that made the violence feel more obscene than it might have on a stormy night when the world already felt dangerous. It was a clear evening, cooling fast the way high country evenings did, and Adeline had been on the porch working through the month's supply ledger when she heard the cattle. Not the usual sound, not the low collective murmur of a settled herd. This was the sharp, panicked bawling of animals that had been startled into movement, and it was coming from the east pasture. She was off the porch before she'd consciously decided to move. Ub was already at the barn, pulling a saddle off the rack. Joaquin was behind him, buckling his gun belt with the practiced speed of a man who'd done it in a hurry before. Out in the east, against the last pale strip of light on the horizon, she could see the cattle moving, a dark, churning mass shifting wrong, shifting fast. "Riders," Abe said, without looking up from the saddle. 3, maybe 4. They came through the fence on the creek side. "How do you know?" "Because that's where I'd come through." He glanced at her. "You stay here." "I'm not staying here." She went for the rifle Hayes had fitted her with 2 weeks before. A Winchester, well-balanced, with a sight she'd spent 3 afternoons adjusting until she trusted it. It was in her room. She went and got it and was back at the barn before Abe had finished tightening the girth. Hayes came out of the darkness from the direction of the north field, already mounted, his face hard in the last of the light. He looked at her with the rifle and he didn't tell her to put it down. He just said, "Stay behind the line of the barn if it comes to shooting. Don't expose yourself on open ground." "I know," she said. They rode east. The riders, 4 of them, as it turned out, had pushed a section of fence flat and scattered the cattle across the creek and into the far scrub. They were gone by the time Hayes's crew reached the break, vanished back into the dark hills to the north, leaving behind a gap in the fencing, 40 head of cattle scattered God knows where, and a dead calf that had broken its leg in the chaos of the stampede. Hayes stood at the broken fence line and looked at the dark hills for a long moment. His jaw was tight. He didn't say anything for a while. "Second fence this week," Duff said from beside him. "I know." "They're testing," Adeline said. Both men looked at her. "They're not trying to take anything yet. They're measuring how fast you respond, where you come from, how many men you can put in the field in the dark." She looked at the gap in the fence. The posts cut clean, not broken, which meant someone had brought tools, which meant this was planned and patient. "Boone does this before he moves on something. He finds the edges first." Hayes studied her. "You know his method. I grew up in Black Hollow. Everyone knows his method, they just don't say it out loud." She turned from the fence. "He'll do this 2, 3 more times. Small damage, nothing you can pin on him directly. Then when he knows your patterns, he'll hit something real." The night was fully dark now, the stars cold and hard overhead. Somewhere in the scrub beyond the creek, cattle were still bawling. "Then we change our patterns," Hayes said. They did. Over the following 2 weeks, Hayes rotated the night watch and varied the timing, shifted where the horses were kept at night, moved the most valuable cattle to the closer pasture where they could be watched from the house. Adeline helped plan it. She had a practical mind for this kind of problem, the kind of thinking you developed when you'd spent years trying to stay one step ahead of a situation that kept deteriorating. She drew out the ranch layout on paper and sat with Hayes and Abe at the kitchen table and went through the approaches, the sight lines, the places where a group of riders could come in without being seen until they were already close. It was the most useful she'd felt since the accounts. Cody, during one of these planning sessions, made the mistake of suggesting that Adeline didn't need to be involved in this particular discussion. He said it carefully, with what he probably thought was consideration, something about how it wasn't her problem to worry about. He was 19, and he meant well, and he was completely wrong. And Adeline looked at him across the table and said quietly, "This ranch is my work and my income and the only place I've got. Whose problem is it if it's not mine?" Cody didn't say anything like that again. The second attack came 12 days later, and it wasn't testing anymore. She woke to the smell before she heard anything. a particular sharp smell that her sleeping mind processed as wrong before she was conscious enough to name it. Then she was sitting up in bed, and the smell was smoke. And through her east window, the horizon wasn't dark. She was dressed and out the door in under a minute. The feed barn was on fire. It had caught fast. Dry summer wood, a month without rain, and whoever had set it had known what they were doing. The north wall was already gone, the fire eating upward into the roof with the greedy momentum of something that had been given exactly what it needed. The light it threw was enormous and orange-red, illuminating the yard in jumping, unsteady colors that made everything look wrong. Abe and Joaquin were already on the water chain, pulling from the horse trough, and the creek bucket by bucket in the organized chaos of men who'd fought a barn fire before and knew it was probably already lost. Hayes was there, his coat off, his shirt dark with water and smoke, directing the effort with the controlled urgency of someone who was afraid and refusing to let the fear make his decisions. Adeline grabbed a bucket. "The supply barn," Hayes called to her over the roar of the fire. "If it jumps to the supply barn, we lose the winter feed. Keep that wall wet." She ran. The supply barn was 40 feet from the burning structure, close enough that the heat hit her like a physical thing when she got between them. She started throwing water on the near wall, refilling from the secondary trough, working in a rhythm that emptied her mind of everything except the next bucket, the next throw, the next refill. Her arms ached, her eyes burned from the smoke. She didn't stop. It was Duff who shouted from the far side of the yard, a single, sharp sound, not words, just alarm. And she turned to see two riders coming fast from the north, through the gate that should have been latched. They weren't carrying water buckets. One of them had a burning torch. Everything slowed down the way it does in moments when your body decides that normal processing speed isn't adequate. She saw the rider with the torch clearly, a big man on a dark horse, moving at a gallop, angling toward the cookhouse and the dry wood stack beside it. If the cookhouse caught, they'd lose the building and Bertie's winter stores and the one warm center of the ranch that everything else organized around. She had the rifle. She'd set it against the supply barn wall when she started with the buckets. She crossed to it in 3 steps, brought it up, found the rider in the sight. He was moving fast, and she had maybe 4 seconds before he reached throwing distance of the cookhouse. She didn't shoot him. She shot the torch. Later, she wouldn't fully be able to explain how she made that decision in that moment. It wasn't calculation. There wasn't time for calculation. It was something more instinctive, the particular instinct of someone who understood that killing a man had consequences that didn't end when the man fell, and that if there was another way, you took it. The torch spun off into the dirt and went dark. The horse shied violently sideways and the rider fought for control, and in the 3 seconds that bought her, Duff was there on horseback, putting himself between the rider and the cookhouse, his own rifle raised. The 2 riders turned and ran. The other one, she had lost track of him in the chaos. She found a moment later. He'd gotten to the supply barn's far side while she was focused on the torch rider, and he'd managed to get a fire started at the base of the wall. Small, not yet established, but hungry. She hit it with 2 full buckets before it could take hold, and it died in a cloud of hissing steam. She stood there, breathing hard, the smoke thick around her, and her hands were shaking. She looked at them, her own hands holding the empty bucket, and the shaking was real, and she wasn't going to pretend it wasn't. She'd just shot a moving target off a galloping horse in firelight at 40 yards. She'd also spent the next 30 seconds running toward a fire someone had just tried to set. Neither of those things felt like bravery from the inside. From the inside, they felt like moving because stopping wasn't an option, and the shaking was what was left when the moving stopped. Hayes found her a few minutes later. The feed barn was a total loss, still burning, but controlled now, the crew having given up saving it and focused instead on keeping it from spreading. He looked at the supply barn wall, still damp and intact. He looked at her. "Duff told me about the torch," he said. "It worked," she said. "It was a hell of a shot. I had a good teacher." She lowered the bucket. Her arms were done. The other one got to the far wall. I got it before it caught. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not quite surprise, but something that had moved past whatever he'd expected and was still sorting out where it had arrived. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No." She looked down at her hands, still shaking. "My hands are doing this. That's normal." "I know it's normal." She set the bucket down. I don't like it. He was quiet for a moment. Then, unexpected, he said, I don't either. Every time. He held up his own right hand briefly. It wasn't completely steady. She looked at it, then at him. Something shifted between them in that moment, in the orange light of the dying feed barn with smoke in the air and both of them shaking and the ranch still standing around them. She couldn't have named exactly what it was. But it was real, and she felt it, and she didn't look away from it. We need to talk about what comes next, she said. Yes, he said. We do. They talked in the kitchen at 2 a.m, all of them. Hayes and Adeline and Abe and Duff and Joaquin, with Bertie standing at the stove making coffee that nobody asked for because she'd decided they needed it, which they did. Cody was outside on watch. He'd drawn the short end of it and accepted without complaint, which put him up considerably in Adeline's estimation. The feed barn was gone. The winter feed inside it was gone. The supply barn had survived. 3 cattle were missing, probably spooked through the broken fence during the commotion. Nobody was dead, which felt like the most fragile kind of luck. He'll come himself next time, Adeline said. Nobody argued with her. Why? Cody called from the doorway. He'd come in for a minute, cold from the night watch. Why not just keep sending riders? It's safer for him, because this didn't work and he knows we know his pattern now. Sending riders again is admitting he can't close the distance. She wrapped her hands around her coffee mug. Boone doesn't admit things like that. He comes himself to prove a point. And when he does, Abe said. Then we're ready for him, Hayes said. How? Cody asked. Carefully, Hayes said, which was not a satisfying answer, but was apparently all he was prepared to say at 2 a.m. with smoke still in his hair. Adeline didn't push it. She had her own thoughts about what ready looked like, and they could sort the details in daylight. Right now, what mattered was that the ranch was standing, and the people in it were alive, and the winter feed was a problem that money could solve, eventually. What money couldn't solve, or couldn't solve easily, was the question that kept circling in her mind as she tried to sleep that night, and mostly failed. Boone wasn't going to stop. He had pride invested in this now, which was more dangerous than money or territory. Pride made men do things that didn't make practical sense, that cost them more than the original problem warranted. He'd decided that Adeline Carter was something he'd been owed and had been cheated of, and the fact that this belief was monstrous didn't make it any less motivating. She lay in her room and listened to the ranch settle, the creak of the house cooling, the sound of Cody's slow footsteps on the porch making his rounds, the creak audible through the window. The east window that had been her first sign that this might be a place she could bear, that faced the dawn so she'd wake to light instead of dark. She thought about her father's kitchen in Black Hollow. The window there faced west, which meant you woke to darkness and the light hit at last. She'd never thought about that consciously before, never connected it to anything. But now it seemed to say something, in the way small things sometimes said large things if you were paying attention. She'd spent her whole life in rooms that faced the wrong direction. She wasn't going back. She sat up, gave up on sleep, and went to the small desk where she kept her working papers. She lit the lamp and pulled out the layout drawing she'd made of the ranch, the one with the approaches and sight lines marked. She looked at it for a while. Then she started making notes. If Boone came himself, he'd come with enough men to feel decisive. 6, probably. Maybe 8. He wouldn't come in the dark. That wasn't his style when he was making a point. He'd want to be seen. He'd come in the afternoon when there was light enough to be impressive, probably from the north road, which was the most direct approach, and the one that gave a view of the main house from half a mile out. If she were setting the defense, she'd want someone in the timber on the north ridge, high ground with a clear sight line to the road. She'd want the main crew visible, but positioned, not clustered together. She'd want Hayes somewhere central, because Boone would be looking for Hayes. And she'd want herself somewhere Boone wasn't expecting her. She worked until the lamp started to gutter and the east window went from black to gray to the first pale suggestion of pink. And then she put on her boots and went to start the breakfast fire in the cookhouse because Bertie was getting old and had been up half the night and deserved to sleep an extra hour. She built the fire and put the coffee on and stood in the cookhouse doorway, watching the sun come up over the eastern ridge. The valley was damp with dew, the grass heavy with it, the cattle in the near pasture moving slow and unbothered in the early light. The burned shell of the feed barn was visible on the south side of the yard, black and collapsed, still faintly smelling of char. An ugly thing, a true thing. She'd helped save everything around it. That was new. That was something she'd never had before. The experience of fighting for something and having the fighting matter, having the something still be standing when the smoke cleared. She didn't know what to do with it exactly. It sat inside her chest, different from anything she was used to carrying. Hayes came out of this house while the coffee was still brewing. He stopped when he saw her at the cookhouse door, and there was a beat of something. A small hesitation that she noticed because he was not typically a man who hesitated. "You made the fire," he said. "Bertie was up until 3. He came to the doorway, and she moved aside to let him in. He poured 2 cups of coffee and handed her one without asking, which she found she didn't mind. She'd gotten used, without noticing, to the fact that he paid attention to what she liked and didn't make a performance of it. They drank their coffee in the doorway with the morning coming on around them. The valley smelled like dew and grass and, faintly, like the rain that the sky to the west might be promising. "The notes I left on your desk," she said, "the ones about the north approach." "I read them," he said. "And?" "And I think you're right about the timber position." He paused. "I think you're also right that he'll come himself. And soon." He drank his coffee. "I don't want you in an exposed position when he does." "I'm not planning to be exposed. I'm planning to be somewhere he isn't looking." That's the same thing in different words. "It's not, actually." She looked at him. "Exposed means unprepared and visible. I'll be prepared and invisible. Those are different things." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "When I was 18, I did something stupid because I thought being brave and being reckless were related." "Were they?" "No. Brave is knowing the risk and doing the thing anyway because it matters. Reckless is not thinking about the risk because you're angry or scared or you want to prove something." She held his eyes. "Which do you think I'm doing?" He was quiet for a moment. "Brave," he said finally. "I think you're being brave." A beat. "I just wanted to say the thing out loud so we'd both know I wasn't confused about it." She turned back to the valley and the coming morning. "He burned our feed barn," she said. "He sent men to torch the cookhouse. He's been picking at this place for weeks." She felt the thing in her chest that was no longer just the cold stone of dread, but something harder and more useful, something with an edge to it. "I'm not interested in hiding while you all deal with what he started." Hayes didn't say anything. He drank his coffee and looked at the valley. "All right," he said at last. Those 2 words, from that man, in that tone, they landed somewhere they would stay. She drank her coffee and watched the sun clear the ridge, and the dew on the grass lit up gold and then faded to ordinary green as the light settled, and the cattle moved slow and calm in the near pasture, and the burned barn stood charred and ugly and real on the south side of the yard. She was ready for what came next. She could feel it, clear-eyed and certain in the morning light, without flinching from the knowledge that ready didn't mean safe, and that what was coming was going to be hard. She'd stopped needing it to be easy somewhere along the way. She couldn't say exactly when, but she knew what it meant. It meant this was hers now, not on paper, not by any legal right, but in the deeper way of things you've put your hands to and your fear into and your nights of bad sleep toward. You fight for what's yours. And you don't apologize for the fighting. She went inside to wake Abe and go over the North Ridge positions in daylight. Boone came on a Thursday afternoon, exactly as Adeline had predicted. He came from the North Road with 7 riders, in the full light of 3 o'clock, riding slow enough to be seen from a distance and fast enough to suggest he wasn't worried about what he'd find when he got there. He was a big man. She could see that from the timberline on the ridge where she'd positioned herself an hour before his arrival. The Winchester laid across a flat rock, the sight trained on the road. Big and deliberate in the saddle, the kind of man who'd learned to use his size as a statement before he opened his mouth. He never made it to the yard. Hayes met him at the gate with Abe and Duff flanking him, and 3 other ranch hands visible at positions that were not accidental. One at the barn, one at the corner of the main house, one with a clear line to the road from the water tower. Cody was in the trees on the east side. Joaquin was somewhere Adeline couldn't see, which meant he was somewhere Boone couldn't see either. She watched through the sight. She could see mouths moving but couldn't hear words at this distance. What she could read was posture. Boone sat his horse with the aggressive ease of a man expecting to win, leaning forward slightly, chin up. Hayes stood his ground with his thumbs in his belt and his feet planted, Not performing anything, just occupying his position with the particular stillness of someone who'd decided how this conversation was going to go before it started. It lasted about 4 minutes. At the end of it, Boone turned his horse. He said something over his shoulder. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the angle of his head. A threat, probably. Something meant to follow Hayes indoors and keep him company at night. Then he rode back up the North Road with his 7 men and the heavy silence of a man who hadn't gotten what he came for. She came down from the ridge with her rifle, and her heart still going faster than she'd prefer.
"What did he say?" she asked Hayes when she reached the gate. "That he wasn't finished." Hayes was watching the road, still that deliberate stillness, that there were other ways to settle a matter than with rifles. "What does that mean?" He turned from the road. His expression had something new in it. Not quite worry, but the close cousin of it, the thing that sits in the jaw when a man is thinking about a problem he doesn't have a clean answer to. It means he found a lawyer. The lawyer's name was Victor Whitlock, and he arrived in Black Hollow 6 days later from the territorial capital, which meant Boone had sent for him before the confrontation at the gate, had been planning this move while simultaneously sending riders to burn fences and cut cattle. 2 strategies running parallel, one violent and one legal. The legal one held in reserve for when the violent one stalled. Adeline learned this from the notice that arrived at the ranch by courier on a gray October morning, delivered by a boy from town who looked sorry to be the one carrying it. She read it standing on the porch, Hayes beside her, the paper formal and dense with language designed to make simple things seem complicated. The core of it was not complicated. Victor Whitlock, acting as legal representative for Frank Carter and certain associated parties, was filing a claim in the territorial court that the transfer of Adeline Carter's debt obligation had been executed improperly, that Frank Carter had signed under duress, and that Adeline herself, as the subject of the original agreement, had never provided legal consent to any subsequent arrangement, and therefore remained under the guardianship of her father, who had the right to determine her, the word used was situation, her situation going forward. The final paragraph informed Rowan Hayes that producing Adeline Carter before the court on the specified date was a legal obligation, and that failure to do so would result in additional proceedings. She read it twice. Then she folded it very deliberately and looked at the gray sky over the valley. "They're saying I belong to my father," she said. "Who belongs to Boone?" "They're saying it legally," Hayes said, "which is different from saying it out loud but means the same thing. Who is Whitlock?" "Expensive," Hayes said. "Good at finding angles in the law that other people missed." He paused. "He's beaten 2 cases like this in the last 5 years. Both times, the woman in question ended up returned to the man claiming authority over her. The cold morning air sat on her skin. What happened to them? The women." Hayes was quiet for a moment. "Nothing good." She stood on the porch and breathed through that. Breathed through the particular fury that came with understanding exactly what was being done and exactly how little the doing of it was disguised. They weren't even pretending this was about law. They were using law as a tool the way you'd use a fence post, something solid to hit someone with. "I'm not going back," she said. "I know. I mean it. I will burn that courtroom to the ground before I walk out of it belonging to my father." "I know," he said again, and his voice was level but his jaw was tight. "But I'd like to try the legal route first." Hayes sent a wire to his own lawyer that afternoon, a man named Prescott in the territorial capital who came, recommended by 2 neighboring ranchers, and who, Hayes said, had a gift for making complicated things simple for judges who preferred simple. He also sent wires to 3 other ranchers in the territory whose land Boone had tried to encroach on over the years, men with their own grievances and their own stories, asking whether they'd be willing to put those stories in front of a court. 2 wired back immediately. The 3rd took a day but said yes. The news of the legal claim spread through the territory faster than Adeline expected, and with a particular appetite she hadn't anticipated. By the end of the week, Black Hollow was talking about nothing else. People she'd never met had opinions about it. The territorial newspaper ran a piece that managed to be both breathlessly interested and carefully neutral in the way of newspapers that wanted to sell papers without being sued. Adeline heard about it from Bertie, who heard about it from the supply merchant, who'd heard it from 3 other people. "They're calling it the Carter affair," Bertie told her, setting a plate of food down with more force than necessary. "Like you're a scandal instead of a person."
I am a scandal, Adeline said. Apparently. You're a woman who left a bad situation and built something better. Half the women in this territory did exactly that, and nobody held a court case about it. Bertie sat down across from her, which she almost never did at the kitchen table. Are you scared? Adeline looked at her coffee. Yes. Good. Smart people are scared of real things. Bertie folded her hands on the table. Are you going to let it stop you? No. Also good. She stood up and went back to the stove. Eat your food. Prescott arrived in the ranch 4 days before the court date, a compact, precise man of about 50, with a lawyer's habit of listening to everything and reacting to almost nothing. He sat at the kitchen table with Adeline and Hayes for 2 hours and took notes on a small pad with a pencil he kept sharp with a pocket knife. He asked questions that started simple and got very specific very fast, and Adeline answered all of them, including the ones that were uncomfortable. When she finished, Prescott looked at his notes for a moment. The original agreement was verbal and informal, he said. Your father maintains it was a business transaction conducted under his legal authority as head of household. It was a gambling debt settled with a human being, Adeline said. Yes. The distinction between those two things is what we'll be establishing before the court. Prescott tapped his pencil on the pad. The duress argument is what concerns me. Whitlock will argue that Mr. Carter signed the cancellation of the debt under pressure from Mr. Hayes, who he'll characterize as using his size and reputation to coerce a vulnerable man into surrendering something he didn't fully understand. My father understood exactly what he was doing, Adeline said. He did it sober, in his own kitchen, after 3 hours of consideration. Can you prove that? I was there. You're not an impartial witness. They'll characterize you as hostile to your father's interests. I am hostile to my father's interests. That doesn't make me wrong about what happened. Prescott looked at her with the professional assessment of a man who was recalibrating something. You're going to testify, he said. It wasn't quite a question. Yes. Whitlock will cross-examine you. He's going to try to make you appear emotional, unstable, or vindictive toward your father. He's very good at this. I know what he's going to try. She held the lawyer's eyes. I'm better at being calm than most people expect. Prescott studied her for another moment. Then he made a note. I want you on the stand early, before they've established their narrative. He looked at Hayes. And I want those neighboring ranchers' statements in writing before we walk in. Hayes nodded. They'll be there. The morning of the court date, Adeline dressed in the best clothes she had, a dark wool skirt and a white blouse she'd bought from the dry goods store in town 3 weeks earlier. Not because she cared about impressions in the abstract, but because she understood that what you looked like in a courtroom was information that people used to decide what they already wanted to believe. She brushed her hair and pinned it back and looked at herself in the small mirror above the writing desk. She looked like herself, a little tired around the eyes, jaw set in the way it got when she was preparing for something difficult. She looked like a woman who was going to walk into a room full of men who intended to decide her future without her input, and she looked like she had thoughts about that. Good, she thought. Let them see the thoughts. The courtroom in the county seat was already half full when they arrived, which told her everything she needed to know about how the territory had decided this was entertainment. Men she didn't recognize lined the benches with the anticipatory energy of people who'd come to watch something happen. She walked in beside Hayes and Prescott and kept her eyes forward and her face still, and she felt every gaze in the room land on her and make its calculations, and she let them calculate. Whitlock was already at the plaintiff's table, a tall man, angular, with the particular groomed confidence of someone who'd won enough times to expect it. He looked at Adeline when she came in with the brief assessment of a man looking at an obstacle, not a person. She held his gaze for 2 seconds longer than was comfortable and then sat down. Her father was there, seated at the far end of Whitlock's table, in a suit that someone had recently pressed for him, looking smaller than she remembered. He didn't look at her when she came in. She didn't go to him. The judge was a man named Calloway, not the Calloway from Black Hollow, a different one, with a gray beard and the permanently skeptical expression of someone who'd been listening to people argue in front of him for 30 years and had stopped being surprised by most of it. He called the room to order with a single bang of the gavel and looked out over the packed benches with mild disapproval. Whitlock opened smoothly, confidently, with the practiced ease of someone who'd given this kind of speech before. He painted a picture of a vulnerable, aging man who'd made a desperate decision in a moment of crisis and been taken advantage of by a powerful ranch owner with a known reputation for aggressive acquisition. He described Adeline as a young woman who'd been misled about her options and exploited by people she trusted. He used the word well-being 4 times in 6 minutes, always in reference to Frank Carter's well-being, never hers. She watched the jury, 6 men, as the law allowed, and watched their faces as Whitlock spoke. Some of them were nodding slightly. That was information. Prescott opened quietly, without theater, and laid out a series of simple, documented facts. The debt amount, the terms, the date and method of transfer, the cancellation document, witnessed and signed. He spoke for 12 minutes and said approximately 300 words more than Whitlock had, but managed to seem like he was saying less, which Adeline recognized as a particular kind of skill. Then Prescott called her to the stand. She walked to the front of the courtroom and sat down, and the room got a particular quality of quiet, the kind that had expectation in it. She looked at the judge, at Prescott, at the faces in the gallery, and she was calm. Genuinely, not performatively. The thing she'd told Prescott was true. She was better at calm than people expected, because she'd spent her life in situations where falling apart wasn't useful, and she'd learned to put the falling apart somewhere internal where it didn't interfere with what needed doing. Prescott walked her through it. The debt. The morning her father told her. The arrival of Rowan Hayes, the choice Hayes offered, the wages, the work, the months at the ranch. He asked her to describe, in her own words, what her life at the Running H had been. Work, she said. Real work. The accounts, the fence lines, the cattle, the planning. I earned my wage, and I earned my place there, same as every other person on that ranch. I'm not kept. I'm not hidden. I'm not controlled. She paused. I'm employed. Those are different things. And your father's claim, Prescott said carefully, that you were transferred without his understanding of the terms. My father understood every word of what he signed, she said. He signed it in his own kitchen, at his own table, without anyone's hand on his back. He signed it because it was the only honorable option available to him, and he knew it. She looked at her father then, across the room. He was still looking at the table in front of him. I don't blame him for taking it. I blame him for what came before it. Whitlock's cross-examination started politely and went somewhere else within 3 questions. He was good. She'd give him that. He had a way of asking things that assumed the answer he wanted, building a frame around each question so that whatever you said fit the shape he'd already cut. He asked about her emotional state on the night in question. He asked whether she'd been frightened by the situation. He asked whether Mr. Hayes had seemed imposing when he arrived in the dark and rain. Yes, she said to all 3. Whitlock paused, clearly expecting more resistance. So you were frightened, and a large, imposing man arrived in the night and told you your options were limited. He told me what my options were, she said. Both of them. He told me I could come with him or I could stay. He told me what he thought the consequences of staying were. He told me the choice was mine. She looked at Whitlock steadily. Nobody had ever done that before, given me a real choice about my own life. I found it notable. A small sound from the gallery. She didn't look at it. Miss Carter, isn't it true that you had no money, no family connections, and nowhere to go? That your options, as you call them, were not really options at all? My options were limited, she said. Limited options are still options. The alternative you're describing, going back to my father, who would have returned me to Silas Boone, who intended to do things to me that no court in this territory would permit me to describe in polite company, that was also an option. I chose the ranch. She let a beat pass. I'd choose it again. Whitlock shifted. Your feelings about the ranch are not... You asked about my choices. I'm explaining them. She kept her voice even. If you'd like to ask me something else, ask it. She saw something flicker in his expression. Not quite frustration, but adjacent to it. He'd expected her to be easier to rattle than this. He wasn't done. He spent another 20 minutes trying, approaching from different angles, questioning her account of her father's state of mind, questioning the nature of her relationship with Hayes in a way that let the insinuation do its work without becoming direct enough to be challenged. She answered everything factually and without decoration. And when he implied things, she named them out loud, which removed their power.
Are you suggesting, she said at one point,
That because I live and work at Mr. Hayes's ranch, there is something improper in that arrangement? I'm suggesting, because if you are, you should say it plainly, and then you should explain to this court how that implication, if true, makes me any less entitled to my own legal freedom. She looked at the judge, then back at Whitlock. I'm 22 years old. I've been managing my father's household and accounts since I was 16. I work for wages at a legitimate operation. I fought to defend that operation when it was attacked. At what point exactly does a woman become entitled to decide where she lives? The courtroom was very quiet. The judge looked at Whitlock. Do you have a further question for this witness? Whitlock looked at his notes. No, Your Honor. The neighboring ranchers testified. Two of them described specific incidents in which Boone's operation had encroached on their land, their cattle, their hired men. One of them was a quiet man named Hargrove, who'd been in this territory for 20 years, who the jury clearly knew and clearly respected, and who described Silas Boone's pattern of behavior with the plain, unemotional authority of someone who didn't need to perform anger to make it felt. He takes what he decides as his, Hargrove said. Always has. The law's been slow about it. He looked at the jury. Not the law's finest hour, gentlemen, but here we are trying again. Bertie testified. Hayes had asked her, and she'd agreed with the particular directness of a woman who had opinions and had been waiting for a suitable venue. She described the Running H's operation, Adeline's work, the months she'd observed. She was asked whether she'd ever seen Hayes treat Adeline in a manner that suggested ownership or control. Rowan Hayes, Bertie said, told that girl where the supplies were kept, what the wages were, and that if she wanted to leave, she could leave. Then he got out of her way and let her work. She paused. In my experience, that's more respect than most women get from men who are legally obligated to them. A longer sound from the gallery that time. The judge didn't gavel it down. Frank Carter testified last, for Whitlock, and it was the most painful thing Adeline had sat through in the entire proceeding. Not because he was persuasive, but because he wasn't. He was a tired, diminished man trying to perform conviction about something he didn't actually believe, and the performance was visible. Whitlock walked him through the narrative they'd constructed, and Frank followed it dutifully, and Adeline watched her father's face and saw the same thing she'd seen in her father's kitchen the night he told her, the man who couldn't look at what he'd done directly. She didn't feel triumph when he stepped down. She felt something heavier and less satisfying. Grief, maybe, for something that had been gone a long time. Prescott's closing was brief and pointed and ended with a single sentence that landed in the silence of the courtroom like a stone in still water. The question before this court is not whether Miss Carter made the correct decision about her life. The question is whether she had the right to make it. The answer to that question should require no deliberation at all. The jury deliberated for 40 minutes. When they came back, Adeline was sitting straight in her chair with her hands in her lap and her face still, and Hayes was beside her, not touching her, not performing anything, just present the way he was present at things, solid and quiet and entirely there. The foreman read the verdict in favor of the defendant. The debt transfer was valid. The guardianship claim was rejected. Adeline Carter was, in the eyes of the territorial court, a free woman with the legal right to live and work where she chose. The gallery erupted. The judge gavelled for order and got partial compliance. Whitlock gathered his papers with the controlled movements of a man declining to show what he felt. Frank Carter sat very still. Adeline sat still, too, for a moment, and let it settle into her. The verdict. The word free spoken in a room full of people, attached to her name, on the record. She turned to Hayes. He was looking at her with that expression she'd come to recognize. The one that had moved past whatever he'd expected and was still sorting out where it had arrived. You were going to leave, he said quietly, under the noise of the gallery. If it had gone the other way. Yes? Where would you have gone? She'd thought about this. In the nights leading up to the court date, she'd planned it out the same way she'd planned the ranch's defenses. Practically, without sentiment, looking at what was real. North first, then west, far enough that the territory's jurisdiction didn't follow. She paused. I told you in the beginning, I wasn't going back. He looked at her for a long moment. I know, he said. I believed you then. I believe you now. Outside the courthouse, the October sun was already low, throwing the street into long shadows. The territorial town was still talking. She could hear it around her, the buzz of people processing what had happened, already turning it into story. The Carter affair. She supposed it would be that for a while. Prescott shook her hand in Hayes's and said something efficient about the legal record, and then excused himself, which was considerate. Adeline stood on the courthouse steps and breathed the cold air. The judge had come out behind them, she realized. An unusual thing, judges staying inside after proceedings. He stopped beside her on the steps, this gray-bearded man with 30 years of listening behind his eyes, and he looked at the street and said, without looking at her, "That was well done, Miss Carter. In there." A pause. "It shouldn't have needed doing at all." "No," she said. "It shouldn't have." He nodded once and went back inside. Hayes came to stand beside her. They looked at the street together, the town going about its afternoon, the horses at the posts, the ordinary machinery of a place that had no idea what had just happened inside that building and wouldn't have cared much if it had. "We should get back," she said. "Bertie's going to want to hear it in person, and she'll be insufferable if we make her wait." Hayes made a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. "We should get back," he agreed. They walked to the horses, and she mounted the gray mare, older now, filled out, no longer a stranger's horse, but hers in the way of things you've ridden through enough hard weather to claim. And she turned toward the road west. The road home. The ride back from the county seat took 3 hours, and for most of it nobody said much. That was fine. Adeline had learned, in the months since she'd come to the Running H, that silence between people who understood each other wasn't emptiness. It was just space. Room for things to settle without being pushed. She rode the gray mare on the road west and let the verdict settle. Let the day's accumulated weight find its proper place inside her, and she watched the high country open up around them as they climbed out of the flatlands and into the valley. The sun was low by the time they came over the ridge. The whole valley spread below them in the late light, the grass gone gold in it, the creek a dark line threading through, the buildings of the ranch small and solid at the valley's center. The burned outline of the feed barn was still visible on the south side, a black scar they hadn't yet cleared away. She'd stopped finding it ugly. It was just true. It was what had happened, and the ranch was still standing around it, and that was the whole story in miniature. Bertie was on the porch when they rode in. She didn't ask. She looked at their faces and she read them, and something in her expression shifted, something that on a different kind of woman might have been called relief, but on Bertie looked more like the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd known the right outcome all along and was simply confirmed. "Supper's been ready an hour," she said. "We won," Adeline said, dismounting. "I know you won. Get inside before the food goes cold." That was Bertie's version of celebration, and it was exactly right. At supper, the whole crew heard it. Adeline told it plainly, without embellishment, the way she'd have reported the account figures. What happened, in order, what it meant. When she got to the part about her own testimony, Cody put his fork down and said, "You said that? To the lawyer? In front of everybody?" With a kind of awe that was slightly embarrassing. "Somebody had to," she said. Abe made a sound that was his version of approval. Joaquin said something to him in low Spanish that she didn't catch, but that made Abe's mouth pull sideways. Duff looked at his plate and nodded once, which from Duff was approximately equivalent to a standing ovation. Hayes sat at the head of the table and ate and didn't say much, but she caught him watching the room once. Just once. A brief survey of the faces around the table, the people who'd held the ranch together through 2 months of attacks and a legal battle that had made their lives into territory gossip. Something crossed his face that she didn't have a name for exactly. Pride was too simple for it. It was more like the feeling of a man looking at something he'd built and seen, clearly that it was real. After supper, after the table was cleared and Bertie had chased everyone out of her cookhouse, Adeline found herself on the porch again. Same chair, same view. The stars were coming out over the eastern ridge the way they always did out here. Not gradually, but suddenly. The sky going from dim to crowded with light in the span of 20 minutes. She'd never seen stars like this in Black Hollow. The town's small lights had been enough to wash most of them out. Hayes came out and took the other chair, and they sat in the kind of quiet that had become familiar between them over months of porch evenings. The particular quiet of two people who'd stopped needing to fill the space.
Whitlock, she said after a while. Will he try again? Not here, Hayes said. He knows the territory now and it doesn't favor his argument anymore. The record stands. A pause. Boone's a different question. Boone's going to be a different question for a long time. Probably. He didn't dress it up. He doesn't forgive easily and he's got a long memory. But he's not stupid. He lost on 2 fronts and he knows we're prepared and he knows the neighboring ranchers are watching him now. Direct action gets expensive when the people around you are paying attention. So he waits. And we stay ready. He looked out at the valley. That's how it works out here. Most things don't resolve clean. You just make the cost high enough that the other side decides their energy's better spent elsewhere. She thought about that. It wasn't a satisfying answer. She'd spent her whole life waiting for clean resolution, waiting for her father to stop gambling, waiting for their situation to improve, waiting for something to change the fundamental direction of things. Clean resolution never came. What came instead were the incremental shifts. A debt canceled, a verdict read, a fire stopped before it spread to the supply barn. Small moments that accumulated into something that resembled a life. I've been thinking, she said. He waited. About the North Timber lease, the one I flagged in the first week. The corner of his mouth moved. You're thinking about the timber lease. We're losing money on it. I've been thinking about it for months. She turned to look at him. If we renegotiate the terms and actually use the full acreage, there's a logging operation that could support the ranch through a bad cattle year. It's not a small thing. It would change the financial picture considerably. He was quiet for a moment. You've been carrying this around since the first week. I've been carrying a lot of things around since the first week. This is one of the practical ones. She paused. I want to sit down with you and Abe and work through it properly. There's also the question of the east pasture. I think we're underutilizing the creek access. With the right fencing, we could run 30 more head without straining the range. He looked at her with that expression again, the one that had moved past expectation. It's 9 o'clock at night, he said, after a court case. I know what time it is. Most people would be celebrating or sleeping. I celebrated at supper, and I don't sleep well anyway. She turned back to the valley. I'm not complaining about that. I'd rather be awake and thinking than asleep and not. A longer silence. The creek was audible below, and somewhere in the timber on the north ridge an owl was doing its irregular thing, calling and then stopping, as if it was thinking about whether to continue. Adeline, Hayes said. Something in the way he said her name, not differently from how he usually said it, but with the weight of someone who'd been deciding whether to say the thing attached to it and had finally decided. She turned to look at him. He was looking at this valley, not at her, which was the only sign that this was harder for him than his voice was letting on. I want to show you something. Tomorrow morning, if you're willing. What is it? I'd rather show you than describe it. He glanced at her. It's not bad. It'll make more sense if you see it. She held his gaze for a moment. She'd learned to read him in 6 months, not fully, not the deep interior of him, but the surface signals well enough. He wasn't worried. He wasn't performing anything. He was asking, plainly, with the particular simplicity of a man who'd decided to stop circling something and just approach it. All right, she said. He nodded, looked back at the valley. They sat there another half hour in the dark and the quiet, and the owl called 3 more times and then apparently found somewhere better to be. He woke her before sunrise. She didn't mind. She was awake before his knock anyway, the way she always was, her east window already going gray with the earliest light. She dressed and met him at the barn where he had both horses saddled, her gray mare alongside his bay, and they rode north out of the valley before the sun had cleared the ridge. He took her up through the timber on the north face, following a trail she'd ridden before, but only part way. He took her the full length of it, to where the trees thinned on the upper slope and the ground leveled out onto a wide bench, flat, grass-covered, sheltered on the north and west by the ridge above, open to the south and east where the land fell away, and the whole valley was visible below. The sun was coming up as they reached it. She stopped the gray mare and looked. She could see everything from here, the full sweep of the valley, the buildings of the ranch, the creek, the pastures, the dark line of the burned barn's footprint, the cattle already moving in the morning cool. Beyond the valley's southern rim, the plains stretched out flat and enormous in every direction, the kind of view that made you understand, viscerally, how large the world was and how small any one life was inside it. It was extraordinary, and she didn't say so because it seemed like something that should be received quietly. "I bought this bench with the valley," Hayes said. He dismounted and was standing at the edge where the ground began to slope, his hat in his hand. "It came with the original deed. I haven't done anything with it because I wasn't sure what to do with it." He looked at her. "I think it's a house site." She looked at him. "The drainage is good. You've got protection from the north wind. Sightline to the valley means you can see everything the ranch does without being in the middle of it." He paused. "It's also private, separate from the working buildings without being far from them." "Whose house?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. The morning was still, the air cold and clean, the horses standing easy behind them. "That depends," he said, "on what you want." She got down from the mare. She walked to where he was standing and looked at the view. The valley, the plains, the enormous sky turning from pink to gold to the ordinary blue of morning. She stood there for a while and didn't say anything. "What are you asking me?" she said finally. He looked at her directly, the way he had from the beginning, without deflection, without the performance of casualness. "I'm asking you to stay, not as an employee." He paused. "As a partner. In the ranch, in the work, in the decisions." Another pause. "And in whatever else you'd want it to mean." She turned to face him. He looked tired, she thought, in the particular way of someone who'd been carrying something for a long time, and had finally set it down, and now didn't quite know what to do with their hands. He wasn't a man who made speeches. He wasn't a man who dressed things in language larger than they needed to be. This was him, as plainly as she'd ever seen him. "Half ownership," she said. "You said partners. Half ownership. Your name on the deed. All of it legal, all of it recorded." He held her eyes. "You've built as much of this as I have this past 6 months." "I've been here 6 months." "I know how long you've been here." She looked at the valley below. The running H, the ranch she'd arrived at soaking wet and sleepless, and armed with a shotgun and $11, believing she was exchanging one prison for another. The ranch she'd rebuilt the accounts of, ridden the fences of, fought for in the dark with a rifle while fire lit up the yard. The people down there, Bertie at the cookhouse fire, Abe and Joaquin checking the morning herd, Cody probably still asleep and being resented for it. The gray mare beside her who'd carried her through this valley in every kind of weather. The east-facing window in her room. "I have a condition," she said. He waited. "I ask you something first, before you ask me anything else." He nodded. She turned to face him fully. The morning light was on his face, and he looked older than he had the night he'd appeared in her kitchen, or maybe she just saw him more completely now. The years in the jaw and around the eyes, the hands that had built 15 years of this place, the particular quality of his stillness that she'd first found dangerous and had since come to understand was simply patience. The patience of someone who'd learned that most things worth having required you to wait for the right moment and not push ahead of it. She said, "Marry me." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a man who'd prepared for several possible conversations and found himself in a different one. "You're asking me," he said. "I'm asking you." She held his gaze steadily. "Because I want it to be my question, my decision, from the beginning, all the way back to the start." She paused. "I've had enough of things happening to me. I want this to be something I did." He looked at her for a long time. The morning light was fully up now, the valley below going bright and ordinary in the way of mornings that followed extraordinary nights. A hawk crossed the open air below them, riding a thermal, unhurried. "Yes," he said. It was not a dramatic moment, and that was fine. Drama had been in large supply recently. What it was true. Two people on a hillside in the early morning, a view of a valley spread below them, a question asked and answered without embellishment. She turned back to the view. He came to stand beside her, and they looked at the ranch below and the plains beyond, and the enormous sky over all of it. "The timber lease," she said after a while. He made a sound that was fully a laugh this time, genuine, from somewhere real. "Right now?" "We're up here anyway. The view helps me think." He shook his head slightly, but he said, "What about it?" She told him what she had worked out, the full renegotiation, the logging potential, the east pasture fencing.
He listened and asked questions and pushed back on 2 points where his knowledge of the terrain gave him information she didn't have, and she reconsidered one of them and held firm on the other and explained why, and he agreed that she was probably right. It was, she thought, the best conversation she'd ever had about money. They rode back down into the valley as the morning proper arrived, and the ranch came to life around them the way it always did. Smoke from the cookhouse, the sounds of the herd, Cody emerging from the bunkhouse looking like a man who'd had exactly enough sleep and was planning to have more. Abe looked up from the fence he was mending near the barn and looked at the two of them, and then looked back at his fence with the expression of a man who'd noted a thing and filed it. Bertie was at the cookhouse door when they came in. She looked at Adeline, looked at Hayes, looked at Adeline again. "Well," Bertie said. "Don't," Adeline said. "I wasn't going to say anything." "You were thinking it loudly." Bertie turned back to the stove. But there was something in the set of her shoulders that was as close to pleased as Bertie ever got in public. The weeks that followed were not simple. Nothing was simple, and Adeline had stopped expecting it to be. Boone's riders cut the north fence one more time in November, and Adeline was the one who rode out in the cold to find the break, with Duff beside her and the rifle across her saddle. They found it, repaired it in the stiff-fingered cold of a November morning, and rode back without incident. Boone didn't come himself. She didn't expect him to. The calculation had shifted, the cost had risen, and Boone was, as Hayes had said, not stupid. There would be other attempts over the years, there always were with men like him. You didn't break that kind of person. You made yourself expensive enough that they moved their attention elsewhere, and you stayed ready, and you lived your life in the space that created. She wrote to Prescott to begin the legal process of adding her name to the ranch deed. He wrote back promptly with the necessary documentation. She read every page of it, twice, before signing, because she was the kind of person who read things before signing them, and she intended to remain that kind of person. She also wrote to her father. It took 3 drafts. The first was angry. She let herself write the angry version, got it all the way out onto the page, and then set it aside. The second was too forgiving, the kind of letter you write when you're trying to perform a virtue you don't fully feel yet. The third was honest, short. She told him she was well. She told him she was staying at the Running H permanently. She told him she didn't blame him for everything, just for the things that were his to be blamed for, which were specific enough that she named them. She told him she wasn't going to pretend those things hadn't happened, but that she also wasn't going to carry them around until they bent her spine. She told him she hoped he found a way to live that was less destructive. She didn't tell him she loved him because she wasn't sure what that word meant in the context of Frank Carter, whether it described something real or just an obligation she'd been born into. She signed it with her name and sent it without expecting a reply. He wrote back in December. 1 paragraph, unsteady handwriting, the kind of letter a man writes when he's out of practice at saying true things. He said he was sorry. He said he knew that wasn't enough. He said he thought about her mother sometimes, about what she'd wanted for Adeline, and he thought maybe things had gone the way her mother would have wanted them to, even if they'd gotten there wrong. He didn't ask to visit. He didn't ask for anything. He just said he was glad she was all right. She read it once, folded it, and put it in the desk drawer where she kept the things that mattered but didn't need to be looked at every day. She didn't write back immediately. Maybe she would in spring. Maybe she wouldn't. She gave herself permission to not know yet. The winter was hard in the way that high country winters always were. Cold that had intention behind it, storms that came in without apology and stayed until they were done. They lost 2 calves in a January freeze and spent 3 days digging the herd out of a drifted draw with shovels and profanity and the particular grim solidarity of people working toward a shared problem. Adeline's hands blistered, and then the blisters hardened, and by February she had the hands of someone who worked outside in all weather, and she looked at them one evening in the lamplight and thought her mother would have recognized them. She kept the accounts, and she added to them a new section for the timber operation they'd begun planning in earnest, the renegotiated lease, the initial survey of workable acreage, the contracts with a mill 40 miles south that Hayes had known about and Adeline had thought to approach directly. The first timber cut wouldn't happen until spring, but the groundwork was done, and the numbers looked good. Not spectacular, good, solid, the kind of good that lasted. In February, she moved the furniture around in her room and then realized what she was doing.
nesting, rearranging her space with the unconscious confidence of someone who was no longer waiting to see if they were allowed to stay. And she laughed at herself, once, quietly, alone in her room, which was something she'd almost never done before. Laughed at herself without cruelty, just noticing. The wedding was in March, at the end of the worst of the cold. She hadn't wanted a large thing. Hayes hadn't either, which was one of the 10,000 small ways they turned out to agree without having to discuss it first. They wanted the people who'd been there, who'd eaten the food and fixed the fences and ridden into firelit yards with rifles and sat in courtrooms and testified and bickered over the last of the coffee in the morning. The people who'd made the Running H what it was, and by extension, made both of them who they'd become inside it. Bertie cooked for 2 days. She complained about this constantly and would have been deeply offended if anyone had offered to help. They married inside the main house, in the front room, because it was still too cold outside, and because the front room was where all the real things had happened, where Hayes had first laid a piece of paper on the table and asked Adeline to look at her options, where Prescott had spread his legal papers, where the crew ate together every morning, and the day got planned, and the arguments got had, and the ordinary machinery of a life ran itself. It seemed like the right room. The judge who'd presided over the territorial case had sent a note when he'd heard, because the territory was small and news moved, and the note said only, "Well done, Miss Carter," or whatever you choose to be called. She'd pinned it to the wall above her desk and left it there. Abe stood with Hayes. Bertie stood with Adeline because Adeline asked her to, and Bertie agreed with the no-fuss acceptance of a woman who'd been asked to do something that mattered and wasn't going to make a scene about being moved by it. Cody cried a little and was embarrassed about it, which Adeline found genuinely endearing. Duff shook Hayes's hand and then, after a brief internal deliberation that was visible on his face, shook Adeline's too and said, "Good," which was approximately 4 more words than he usually used for emotional occasions. Joaquin made a speech in Spanish that nobody except Abe could fully follow, but the shape of it was clear and the feeling in it was clear, and that was enough. After, when the food had been eaten and the evening had turned the particular warm color of a room full of people who were glad to be in it, Adeline stood at the front room window and looked out at the valley in the last of the day's light. The snow was still on the ridge to the north. The creek was audible, running higher than it had all winter, beginning its spring climb. In 2 weeks, maybe 3, the grass would start coming back. The cattle would go to the east pasture. The timber survey crew would arrive. The work that never fully stopped would shift into its spring shape. Hayes came to stand beside her. He had a cup of coffee because he always had a cup of coffee. She'd started drinking hers the way he drank his, black, no sugar, sometime around October. She wasn't sure exactly when. "You're thinking about the east pasture fencing," he said. "No." She paused. "Partially." He looked at her sideways. She looked back at him. And there it was again, that thing between them that had no clean name, that had grown in the space created by honest work and bad weather and a fight worth having. Not the love of stories, the clean and frictionless kind, the real kind, which was more ungainly and more durable, and had calluses on it the same way her hands did. She'd started out believing she was exchanging one cage for another. She'd been wrong, and she was glad she'd been wrong. And she was never going to be naive enough to think that gladness meant the road had been easy. It hadn't. It wasn't going to be. Boone's shadow still moved at the edges of the territory. The winters would keep coming with intention. The work would keep being work. She'd keep being a woman in a world that had specific and limited ideas about what women were allowed to be, and she'd keep deciding those ideas didn't apply to her, and that decision would keep costing something. That was the truth of it, laid out plain. What was also true, she was here. This was hers. Not by inheritance, not by someone else's grace, but by the accumulation of days and decisions and fights, and the willingness to choose again every morning, even when it was hard. Her mother had wanted something for her. Something she hadn't been able to name exactly, just pointed at from a distance during a conversation with a stranger in a place she was passing through. Something like this, maybe. Not perfect, not uncomplicated, but real and chosen and hers. Adeline looked at the valley going dark outside the window, and the snow on the ridge, and the creek she could hear but not see, and the burned barn's footprint still visible on the south side of the yard. The record of what they'd come through, not removed but absorbed, part of the landscape now.
She thought about the girl who'd ridden out of Black Hollow in the rain with $11 and a photograph and 4 shotgun shells, and the cold belief that she was simply moving from one bad situation to a different one. That girl had been wrong. She'd also been brave and practical and clear-eyed enough to take the one real option in front of her, even when she couldn't see where it led. She'd done the work of figuring out the rest as the rest arrived.
That was all it ever was, really. Not a grand plan, not a destiny, just the willingness to show up for the next thing and bring everything you had to it and not look away when it got hard. She'd done that. She was still doing it. She intended to keep doing it. "The East Pasture," she said to Hayes. "What about it?" "Spring, first week. I want the survey done before the crew starts on the timber." He was quiet for a moment. "You want to do both in the same week?" "I want to plan for both. The doing will take longer." "It will take considerably longer." "I know." She turned from the window. The room behind them was full of the sounds of the people she'd chosen. The argument Abe and Joaquin were having about something she'd never know the origin of, Cody's laugh at something Bertie had said, Duff's silence that was its own kind of presence. "We have time." Hayes looked at her. "We do," he said. She went back into the room, back into the warmth and the noise, and the ordinary mess of a group of people who decided to make a life together in hard country, and she picked up her coffee and she listened to the creak through the window and the voices around her, and she was not at peace in any soft sense of that word. She was better than at peace. She was home,